Hi, I'm Sarthak, and I have with us Rohin Bhatt and Nidhi Agrawal. Nidhi and I are editors at LSPR, and Rohin Bhatt is a lawyer who works at the Supreme Court of India. Rohin, why don't you start by introducing yourself, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, I'm Rohin. I'm a lawyer. I'm a human rights lawyer. I graduated from Gujarat National Law University in 2021. Then I went on to do my Master of Bioethics at Harvard Medical School. Amongst other things, I am a co-founder of the Indian Bioethics Project. My work focuses on constitutional law, bioethics with a focus on feminist and queer approaches to bioethics and the effects fascism has on human rights.
Sure, thanks. So this is a series we're doing for LSPR where we're inviting queer authors to write on queer issues on law and policy through a queer perspective. Nidhi, why don't you introduce the podcast series?
So, what we have been trying to also put forward through the column that we are introducing is experiences that advocates and queer activists generally go through in their work as in the queer field, in the queer activism field. And I think we have till now interviewed, I think, two people already, and this would be wonderful taking forward.
Yeah. So we'll just start with the questions now. Rohin, the piece that you decided to write on LSPR specifically focused on healthcare and healthcare access for queer individuals. Why did you particularly choose that topic to write on? Is it something that you have personally seen a lot in your practice, or is it because you have a specialization in bioethics? Could you tell us about that?
Right. So the reason I decided to write about healthcare and the reason I chose to study bioethics comes from my own experiences as being discriminated against within medicine. Uh, what happens is, as a queer person, whenever one goes to get tested for STIs, there are these usual questions about why do I need a test? I'm told often that I don't need a test. Uh, there's looks, there's judgment, and that is why I think medicines for so much of medicine operates on an epistemic position of heterosis normativity. Um, that as a queer person, accessing healthcare becomes difficult. And in these contexts, the conceptual binaries of male and female, or masculine and feminine, or heterosexual and queer are so rigid that sometimes it becomes extremely difficult for people to access medicine. And this rigid categorization, as Melanie Judge puts it, is overlaid with gender, racialized, and class inequalities, which animate how heterosexuality continues to operate as the privileged, universal, and unmarked sexuality, whilst queerness remains minoritized, particularized, and othered. Now, look at India, right? It has been good law since at least Bandhua Mukti Morcha that right to healthcare is a fundamental part of Article 21. And therefore, to leverage my position as a queer male, albeit from an upper caste and upper class position, to leverage my platform to destabilize epistemic injustices, and in doing so, not just uh, occupy the spaces as a queer person, but also make spaces for those that have so far been left out of conversations around medicine. And then, under ordinary circumstances, what happens is um, so much of these conversations are around, especially in healthcare case spaces, around the medicalization and the pathologization of queerness, and that trend needs to change. So as a queer person, I seek to locate myself at the center of these injustices, at the same time recognizing my own privilege, and focus my work on the hitherto underrepresented experiences of LGBT plus people and recognize that heterosis normativity is a dangerous political and social determinant of health. Now, what happens is the agility of science-based affirmative framework of queer health and queer bioethics will render it especially valuable from shifting interventions that have so far been used to marginalize queer people into those that can be adopted by a diverse range of personnel, from doctors to nurses, and even those outside the formal healthcare system, like your ASHA workers. So I seek to locate my scholarly work and my activism at the intersections of medicine, healthcare, law, and my own queerness.
Just following up on that, Rohin, so uh, what do you think have been the implications of heteronormativity in the medical field specifically? Are there any particular instances that people who you have engaged with have faced, or you personally have faced, that you would like to share with us?
I won't go into particular experiences for two reasons. First, I come from an extremely privileged position and I want to acknowledge that. And for that, I have been able to access the best of healthcare, and I don't think it's my position to speak to experiences of other queer people. But on a broader space, there needs to be a critical space to push the boundaries which have been embraced as normative and to speak back to the hegemony and the various norms of gender, sexuality, and being. And for that, I think the best experience is that of Ananya Kumari Alex. Now, Ananya Kumari Alex was one of the first trans radio jockeys in India. She passed away recently from medical negligence. She underwent uh, a gender reaffirming surgery. After that, it has been alleged that gross medical negligence led to severe healthcare complications. In a piece to the Q, Ananya said that every time she sneezed, laughed, or even brushed her teeth, she had severe discomfort. And if you read those interviews, it's extremely painful just reading it, and to think that somebody might have gone through that, it shakes one to the core. Ananya says something very powerful, and she says, it looks like my private part has been cut ruthlessly with a knife. And to me, that allegory is so powerful in our experiences as queer people, that our lives are ruthlessly slashed with knives. Now, if you look at the history of the queer movement in India, which starts in the late 1990s, the first petition that is filed to provide condoms in Tihar jail for men who are having sex with men. Now, since then, right down to Navtej Singh Johar, what you see is an overarching theme of queerness being medicalized, of queer people being unable to access healthcare, or pathologization of queerness being at the forefront of decriminalization of homosexuality. Similarly, with Trans Act, what you saw was gender being medicalized. To their credit, the Indian Psychiatric Society comes out only in Navtej to say that queerness is no longer something that needs to be cured, but we need to realize that there's still rampant homophobia in medicine. There is uh, transphobia writ large in attitudes of doctors that we still need to tackle. And it will not be done overnight. And I recognize that we need to take it every day to combat these hegemonies day in and day out, and to place the lived experiences of queer people rather than theorize on queer experiences, and let theorizations become the path to theorize how we go about conceptualizing queer rights in clinical landscapes.
Yeah, thanks for that answer, Rohin. I think your point on focusing on real life experiences is well taken. Now, a question is a follow-up on that only. So while starting the column, one of the questions that we face and we still face is how helpful can inclusion within academia be? So while we're writing this piece on lack of access to healthcare to queer individuals, how helpful do you think as an academician a queer person can be? Do you think queer individuals have the burden of taking up activism, or do you think that inclusion within academia and bringing queer perspectives within academia is an end in itself that we should be aiming to achieve?
Right. I think that's quite a complicated question, and I think I'm going to divide my answer into two parts. First is how I see my own queer activism, and second is the larger question of queer representation within academia. Now, for me as a queer person, so much of my queerness, my desires, my sexuality informs the work that I do. And I don't disjoint my work from my queerness. I've been told that academia does not have safe spaces, law does not have safe spaces for queer people. And I have learned that I can do meaningful work not despite of my queerness, but because of it. Um, and so I look at myself and my queerness as a radical act in itself. And it becomes important that queer people um, are given those safe spaces. But at the same time, it is not on queer people to be activists all the time. I think this is where allies come in. Uh, Allies can help in creating safe spaces, in starting these conversations, so that the burden is not always on queer people to uh, make these safe spaces safe for themselves. But at the same time, I think placing queer lived realities at the center of making queer academic spaces or queer legal spaces or queer clinics, I think it becomes important. That is not to say that, uh, let's look at it this way, right? Awareness of oppression, feelings of connectedness and support are important between allies and queer persons. But at the same time, the savior complex of allies should not take precedence over creating safe spaces for queer people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Nidhi, why don't you take up the next question?
Sure. I think I would just like to follow up on what you have just said. So, how do you see the role of allies specifically in the development of healthcare for queer individuals? Like, what can allies do which would make healthcare more inclusive specifically?
Right. I think there are four ways of looking at allies, right? First is looking at allies as sponsors. Uh, in that, by what I mean is allies should look for opportunities where they can bring queer people into the conversation, highlight the work of queer people that may have gone unnoticed, commit to diversity. The second role that I see of ally is an ally as an amplifier. That ally not only works to ensure that marginalized voices are heard, but that they are also respected. Again, and this can take many forms, but let me, for the purposes of this conversation and specifically in the clinic, talk about uh, focus on representation within communication, right? Say a person goes for a sonography and the person sees that the doctor sees that the patient has a uterus. Now, a normal reaction would be to think that the person is a woman, a cis woman, as it were. But a conversation about the person's gender identity has to be had sensitively. And there are people who've written about it, and recognizing that there are people who've written about it and bringing those voices into these conversations becomes important. The third, and to my mind, is the most important role is that of an upstander and not a bystander. An ally, whenever they see wrongdoing, has to act to combat it. Otherwise, your allyship is meaningless. You need to push back on offensive comments, on offensive jokes. You need to vehemently push back against discrimination within your social circles, within your professional circles, and within your families. Allies need to recognize that they have some privilege. And again, this goes across intersectionalities, right? And as a person of privilege, allies have access to social circles that others do not. And in those circles, you will see such comments being passed. I've seen those, and I'm sure others will have. In that case, it becomes important for allies to shape up for belief, to step up and shape people's beliefs and speak up for those that might not be there. And finally, the fourth and the last role of allies that I see is an ally as a confidant, where ally creates a safe space for underrepresented groups, not just queer people, right, but across intersectionalities to express their fears, frustrations, and needs. Simply listening to stories goes a long way. And if you see yourself as a confidant, as an upstander, as an amplifier, and a sponsor, if you do these four things, I think your allyship is much more powerful than anything you can do as allies.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rohin. We'll just move to the next question now. So you yourself on your social media platforms talk a lot about not divorcing your identity from your work. So our question regarding that would be, have you yourself ever faced experiences of discrimination, or have you found law as a practice sometimes to be inaccessible because of your identity? Given that you work a lot in the Supreme Court of India, so have you faced such experiences in your practice?
Right. I don't. And I want to reiterate that this comes out of a position of extremely privilege. I have a senior who has created a safe space in her office for me. I've gone into office with my nails painted red, and, nobody said anything. And we need to recognize that that might be true for me, but it is not true for a lot of people. And that means that for me as a queer person who predominantly works in the Supreme Court, this might be look at who makes it to the Supreme Court. First of all, you have to be a person of extreme privilege to be living in Delhi. You have, and the people who come to the Supreme Court in most cases, the lawyers, uh, are people of privilege, and so you might not notice it, but that is by no means an indicator of how a queer person in a remote village lives, or that might not even be true for a queer person living not just living in a tier one city like Delhi, right? Let's not limit ourselves to rural and places. So I have not, but that is only because I have a senior who's supportive of my queerness. I have extreme privilege, and that is the only reason that I don't have an experience of being discriminated against in my professional spaces. I mean, that's not to say, every time I walk into the court, there might be somebody who looks at my painted nails, but, that doesn't bother me much.
Um,
I think
yeah, sorry.
I think that's a very it's very humble of you to realize that you do come from a place of privilege, because I think that's one thing that we miss in law school as well, where we don't really understand a fair bit of it, why
Yes,
and
I think
where
it
it.
becomes important. And I think even when I say it and you call me humble, I don't think I'm being humble. I think so much of it is, I think I am still learning and unlearning stuff and my own internal biases about my privilege. I think every time my friends have called me out on uh, not recognizing my own privilege, I've felt offended sometimes. And I think that still tells us that unlearning your biases is a constant process that one has to do all throughout one's life, and doing that is hard work, and we all need to necessarily put down work into that. As you know, when we go to law school, especially as national law schools, I think we need to recognize that within our own circles, and querying our own circles will tell us about our own biases. And who do we mingle with? Do we mingle with only people who are fluent in English, or do we mingle with, you know, people who come from the same socioeconomic background as us? I think that raises important questions about our own biases, and learning about our privilege and unlearning is a constant process that we must continue to do. And I think it becomes more important for us as lawyers, even though, you may practice any branch of law, be it corporate law or securities law, due to human rights law. You need to recognize that uh, your clients might often not come from the same positions as you do, and you need to recognize and empathize with your clients, and that takes a lot of putting work into it. And anybody who says that I've perfected the art of allyship has not.
Yep. Thank you for that answer, Rohin. So our next question is regarding your paper only. So the criticism that's often given of the line of cases starting from Naz and then going down to Nalsan of Tej is that these cases tended to focus on Section 377 as a private act, and what the queer community ended up getting is just the right to have sex with each other and nothing else. And we just had rhetoric and a vocabulary of rights being used by the court, but nothing on ground. So, in your paper, when you talk about queer bioethics, what do you think is the scope for queer bioethics in India, and what do you think we can do with it in India, especially given that there's rampant conversion therapy going on, even if it's outlawed or illegal, but there's still conversion therapy that happens in India, and there are harrowing experiences of conversion therapy. So, what do you think is the role that queer bioethics can play, especially in India?
Right, let's start with talking about Navtej and Nalsa and the vocabulary of rights. I think Navtej and Nalsa are important milestones in the history of the queer rights movement in India. But what we have here is a very sanitized version of history that is presented to the courts, and the stories that are told to the courts, right? Let's look at the stories which are told to the court. And I think V. Queeram and Akhil Kang point this out really beautifully, that only when IITians go to court that do the courts recognize that there is discrimination against 377. And if you look at the talk given by Menka Guruswamy and Arundhati Kaju, the versions of stories that they seek to present are those of upper class individuals. And in these conversations, your trans people who are begging at signals are erased. Your Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi sex workers who've been at the forefront of these conversations since 1990s, and even prior to that, they get erased. Uh, and so again, it's a product of how class and caste play a factor in what stories are told in courts and what notions of respectability the court accepts. And the second issue that you point out is that of our paper and what Sarthak and I talk about homophobia. Now let's look at two things. The draft medical ethics guidelines that NMC issues, and the Madras High Court judgment only look at it as a professional malpractice. Now, what that means for that doctor is that at the worst, it will result in a suspension or termination of his license to practice medicine. But this is problematic because so much of this happens outside of your uh, evidence-based medicine, what is commonly called allopathic medicine. So much of this happens in your Ayurvedic medicine, which fall outside the purview of the NMC. There is, and so much of this happens in by these babas and these tantrics, and even, and this is not limited to people that in settings that might be unknown to us. This is Baba Ramdev who's talked about it. There's, all sorts of these people who think of queerness to be a private act, but queerness is not a private act, and it cannot be cured. It does not need to be cured. When I walk out on the street, uh, I let me not talk about let's talk about this. Let me rephrase it. When we talk about queerness, we need to recognize that it is very public. Some people do have passing privilege, and there's a reason that it's called the passing privilege, because if you do not have that privilege, you will be suspected of homophobia and queerphobia. So let's not think of queerness as a private act. Now, the second issue therein is, should professional malpractice or professionally unethical act be limited to it? There are two aspects to it. There are scholars who argued that introducing criminal law within the ambit of medicine will make medicine more inaccessible, and this has happened in conversations around abortion and queerness too. But the second issue is, I think we need to talk about a balancing of rights within the scope of a balancing of within the clinic, and to think if the if introducing criminal law within the clinic is important enough to balance it against the harm that is caused by queer people, harm caused to queer people within the clinic, right? Think of Anjana Harish, who had to take her, who died by suicide. Think of hundreds of other Anjana Harishes that do not make it to the front pages of newspapers. Think of people who are forced every day to subject themselves to harms. I've had friends who voluntarily put themselves in these conversion camps. So these conversion camps are a symptom of a larger issue around homophobia in medicine. But at the same time, we need to decide if, and I've not settled on this answer, if introducing criminal wrong and the criminal law within the clinic is the right answer. Should it be perhaps be addressed by a civil law? Should a tortious action, like given the state of tort law in India? I don't have answers to these questions for myself, and I can't answer it for you, but these are issues that we need to grapple with within medicine, within law, and within queer rights movement as a whole.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful, and I think it teaches a lot to us about how it gives us a different perspective on how to basically look at the issue. Because I think specifically in law school, we generally look at things black and white, and this kind of sorry for the pun, but opens up a spectrum of opinions that we can have on the issue. I just had one last question for you that
To follow up to that and to say,
yeah.
how insight is. This is why it becomes important to talk about lived experiences, and this is why it becomes important to situate these diverse experiences in our conversations. And the second thing you said that kind of resonated with me was how uh, we in law schools we are told to think of an act as black or white. It's never black or white, it's all 50 shades of gray. uh, and that's what led me to bioethics, is that we are so used to think of an act as legal or illegal, or as simply as something that is allowed versus something that is not allowed, that we often lose out the nuances in these conversations, and that to acknowledge that sometimes there are no right answers, and to acknowledge that sometimes even if there are right answers, we don't have them right now. So I think it becomes important to remember these things as we go through our everyday lives in law school, Navtej is much more than just 377. And Nalsa is much more than recognition of trans identities as third gender. I think if you look at uh, Nalsa and Navtej and critiques of trans scholars, especially around these and about how these these judgments in themselves have to a certain extent erect violence upon queer lives. You see that yes, there is a massive positive aspect to these judgments, but at the same time, these judgments have Nalsa, for example, in subsuming all identities under uh one identity of third gender, you forget that there are diverse trans identities that this country possesses, from Hijras to Kothis to Aravanis, that and all of these have rich cultural practices in themselves, rich traditions, rich lived experiences, lived ways of going about their own lives, different gods that they worship, different languages that they speak. And to acknowledge, but more importantly, to recognize that the law always does not have the vocabulary to to cover all of our experiences within itself, and to go beyond. This is where the ideas of critical legal studies become more important in our scholarly work and in our day-to-day legal work.
Um, Thanks for that answer, Rohin. But we've just had a very great time working with you on the piece and this podcast. Thank you for agreeing to work with us. We really had a fun time, all of us, and we hope
Absolutely,
that
it's been a pleasure working with you guys.
yeah. Just Nidhi, if you have any comments, and Rohin, you also.
Just one cute question that we ask at the end of the podcast is that whether you have any comments or just any message for queer kids out there who are in law school, who are students in schools, or just anything you want them to know.
To queer kids, I always say this, that, you know, you are going to be told every day that you are not enough. You're going to be told that your identity is too much, or you will be too much for legal spaces. I say to them, pay no heed to those words. Uh, that is not to say that, it's always going to be a cakewalk. There are going to be instances, but a belief in yourself is going to be very important. And a lot of us struggle with uh, imposter syndrome. I struggled with it to this day, and it amplifies itself when you are queer. So, just keep calm and carry on, I guess. And know that there are people out there who are going to be there to support you, to create safe spaces for you. Reach out to them. People are more friendly than they seem.
Yeah, I think keep calm and carry on would be our t-shirt logo from now on.
But
Yeah,
yeah, that's all from our end. And thanks for joining. We really had a
No
very good
problem.
time.
I
We'll
hope I
get
didn't ramble on too much.
so it was wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right, no problems. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.